Welcome back into the Simulator series. In today's episode, we're going to be creating the settings system. Now, hopping directly into Studio, the first thing we're going to do is create the GUI. So we're going to go inside of the Starter GUI, and then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and duplicate the code's GUI. We'll then go ahead and rename this to be called settings, and then we're going to go ahead and enable it. Now that we have this enabled, what we're going to do is select the text box BG, the confirm text button, and the subtitle text label, and then we're going to go ahead and delete all of those. Now that we've deleted all of those, let's go ahead and update the text of the title text label, which should say settings. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and actually resize the frame a little bit as well. I want this to be a little bit taller, and then I'm also going to make it a little bit skinnier. So I think something like that, and then I'm going to make sure to center this, and there we go. Now that we've done that, we definitely have to resize the title text label as well as the exit button, and let's go ahead and do that. Now that I've repositioned the exit button, I'll then also reposition the title text label as well, and then I also might make this a little bit smaller just to be the same size as the exit button. Now that we've done that, what we're going to do is create a scrolling frame inside of here, and we're going to rename this to be called container. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and resize this. Of course, we're going to be setting this to scale. Now for the size of this, we pretty much just want this to be a little bit below the title text label, and then we also want it to be a little bit smaller than its parent frame as well. Okay, so that sizing looks pretty decent to me. What I'm then going to do is make sure that we center this horizontally, so 0.5 and 0.5. Then we can go ahead and adjust a couple of other properties of the container. The first property that we're going to update is the canvas size, and we're going to change this from 2 to 1. We'll then adjust the scroll bar thickness, and I'm going to set this to 6. We'll then set the background transparency to 1 as well, so that we no longer see that. Cool. Next, what we're going to do is create a UI grid layout inside of the container, and then we'll also create a frame as well, which we're going to rename this frame to be called template. Now, go into the UI grid layout. For the cell size, we're going to go with 1 on the X scale and 0.2 on the Y scale. Now that we've done that, we can see our template frame being resized. Then for the cell padding, all we have to do is set the Y scale, and we're going to set that to 0.01 so that there's just a very, very small spacing between them. We can then duplicate the template a couple of times and see how these are going to be laid out. And of course, we can come back and adjust these when we're done to get a better view of what they look like when they're completely finished. Anyway, we can go ahead and delete every template except for one. Then what we're going to do is go inside of this template and create a UI list layout. We'll then also set the background transparency of the template to 1, and then we'll go ahead and create an image button. We're going to rename this image button to be called toggle. We'll then set the image property to blank because we don't actually want to use an image here. Instead, what we're going to do is adjust the background color 3, and we'll go ahead and set that to a nice red. Now that we've done that, of course, we have to resize it, so let's just go ahead and make that scale. Now for the size of this, we basically want it to be a small checkbox. So for the size on the X, I'm going to go with 0.1 scale and 0.75 Y scale. What I'm then going to do is actually update the background transparency of the template frame that we just changed because I want to be able to easily tell where this button is positioned within inside of this frame. Anyways, now that we've done that, we now have a reference to see where the position and also the size of this button as well. Anyways, with this toggle button, we do need to center it vertically. So what are we going to do? Well, we're actually going to go ahead and update the UI list layout. Now, we're going to set the fill direction to vertical, and then we'll set the vertical alignment to center. Now that we've done that, we can see that the toggle button is centered vertically. Now, inside of this button, we can go ahead and create a UI corner, and I'm going to go ahead and set the corner radius to 0.15 to make this button a little bit less square and a little bit more round. Now that we've created the toggle button, what we're then going to do is duplicate the title text label and drag that inside of the template frame. We're going to rename this text label to be called setting, and for the text of this, we're just going to say music, as this is one of the settings as we're going to be able to toggle in our game. Now, next what we're going to do is go ahead and resize this. And if you're wondering why when we resize this, it's kind of acting very weird or unusual, that's because we have the UI list layout, which is controlling each of these elements' properties. So that's why the position is different than normal when we resize it. Anyways, for the size of this text label, on the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.5, and on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 0.85. Now that we've done that, what we're then going to do is set the text X alignment to left. In addition to that, we're going to go ahead and change the font, as we'll no longer be using bold. Now, I think I actually might want to make this text label just a little bit smaller, so I think that sizing is pretty good. And now that we've done all of that, what we're then going to do is go ahead and update the background transparency of our template, because we're actually done with creating this. Now, one more thing that I almost forgot, we actually have to modify one more property of the container, and that is the automatic canvas size. We want to set this to Y, and now that allows us to generate an unlimited amount of templates inside of here. What we can then do is go ahead and duplicate this a couple of times and see how it looks, and I think that looks pretty good. Of course, we could go back to the UI grid layout, and if we want to adjust either the sizing or the padding, we can do that right here. But since I think this looks all good, I'm going to go ahead and delete all of the templates except for one. And with that being said, we are actually completely finished with creating this GUI. So now that we've finished creating that GUI, we can go ahead and close the starter GUI. And now what we're going to do is work on creating the settings config. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and we're going to go ahead and create a new module script. We'll go ahead and rename this module script to be called settings. And for the module variable, we're going to rename this to be called settings as well. Now, we're going to start off by creating a type, which is going to be a string union, and each of these strings is going to be a unique setting. Now, that probably sounds a little confusing, but don't worry, just follow along. So since we're creating this type, we also want to share this type with any module scripts that require this. So we're going to say export, which will export that type to any module scripts that require this one. Then we'll use the keyword type to indicate that we're creating a type, and then we'll set the type name similar to how we would set a variable name. We'll then set the value, and again, this is going to be a string union. Now, the first setting that we're going to create is going to be called click sound, and since this type is a string union, we can go ahead and use the pipe symbol after indicating our first setting. Now, after we use the pipe symbol, we can then include another string, which will be our second setting. Now, my second setting is going to be called music, and then again, we can use the pipe symbol and add another string. So I'm going to go ahead and do this for every single one of our settings. So I just added all of our settings to the union, and of course, the formatting of this looks a little bit different. The reason I went this way with it is because I think this makes it a lot easier to read. If it's all on a single line, you really can't even read it because it goes completely off the screen. Now, I think there's a better way to kind of properly format this for the IDE, because when you hit enter, we can see that this goes all the way to the beginning of the line. I'm just really not sure how Roblox intends for us to do that, so that's why I created the union like this. Now, I recommend that you include all of our settings into your own module script so that you can follow along and see how we implement them. But of course, you can choose to use whatever settings you prefer. What we're then going to do is create a table which contains all of these settings as well. So we're going to say settings.settings, and we're going to set that equal to a table. Now, what we're going to do is copy all of these strings and paste them directly inside of here. What we're then going to do is highlight the pipe symbol and then hit Control H. This should open up Find and Replace. Now, what we're going to look for is the pipe symbol, and the second box is for what we want to replace the first box with. Now, what do we want to replace this with? Well, we actually want to replace it with a comma because we're creating a table. Then what we're going to do is move our cursor back to where we create the settings variable at. Then we'll go back to the Find and Replace table, and now we can hit Enter, and now we can see that we have the first pipe symbol selected. So with our cursor in the second box, we can then hit enter, and we can see that that has now been replaced. So we'll go ahead and do that for each and every one of them. But of course, don't replace the pipe symbol for when we create the type. We should only replace that inside of our settings variable. Cool. So now that we've created that, what we're then going to do is actually create a function. This is going to be called isSettingActive. It's going to accept a setting, which is going to be of the setting type, and it'll also accept the player's data as well. Now, this function is going to be incredibly simple. All we're going to do is return data, and inside of the player's data table, we are going to create a settings table in just a few minutes. And of course, that settings table is going to hold all of the player's setting data. Now, how that table is going to be structured is it's simply going to be a dictionary with the settings for the keys and booleans for the values. So that's how we're going to track if the setting is toggled on or off. So going back to this function, we're going to return data, and now we need to access the settings table of the player's data. And once we get the settings table, what we're then going to do is index that with the specific setting. And then we're going to return the value of that setting, which is either going to be true or false. And now that we've created that function, we're actually done creating the settings config. So we can go ahead and close out of that. Next, what we're going to do is update the player's data. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data folder, and open up the template module script. Now that we're inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and create a variable for the settings config. And now that we've created a variable for that, what we're then going to do is go ahead and copy and paste the default codes table along with the for loop. We'll go ahead and rename this variable to be called default settings, which of course is going to be equal to a blank table. We'll of course then go ahead and loop through the settings table. So the key is going to be the index. So we're going to set that to underscore because we're not going to use that. And the value would be the specific setting. And we'll also set the type here to settingsconfig.setting, because otherwise Roblox does not actually know what this value would be. And now that we've set that value, we also have to update the table that we're looping through. And also, I don't know why this says do in here. That's kind of odd. Anyways, we'll be looping through the settings table inside of the settings config. And now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and of course update the default settings table with the specific setting. And now you can determine if you want most of your settings to be toggled on or off by default. Now, I'd say it's more likely than not that you probably want most of your settings to be toggled on. So we're going to set them equal to true by default. But if we want to select few to be disabled, we could easily do that as well. Let's say, for instance, that we want the AFK hatching setting to be disabled by default. What we'll do is we'll say if setting equals AFK hatching, then, and then what we can do is copy and paste this line right there. And instead of setting that to true, we'll set that to false. And of course, you can continue this if statement for any other settings that you want to have disabled when the player first joins the game. And of course, you can swap this around if you wanted to as well. You can have most of the settings toggled off by default and then only toggle on a few. Anyways, now that we've done that, what we have to do is of course add that table to the player's data. So we'll go below the codes table, creating a settings table, and we'll set that equal to the default settings. Perfect. Now we've implemented the player's data. Now that we've updated the player's data, what we can then do is start scripting the settings system on the server side. So we'll go inside of the server script service, and we'll go ahead and create a brand new script. We'll then rename this script to be called settings. Inside of here, we're of course going to need a couple of variables. So we'll need the replicated storage. We'll also need the server script service. Then we'll need the player's data manager from the server script service. So we'll say player data equals require server script service player data manager. We then also want to get the settings config as well. And now we've required both of those. One thing I almost forgot, we do need to create the networking for this. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the remotes folder, and we're going to go ahead and create a brand new remote event. And this is going to be called update setting. Cool. So heading back into the script, what we'll then do is create a variable for the remotes folder, which is inside of the replicated storage. Now we'll use the remote event that we just created to listen for when the player wants to toggle their setting on or off. So we'll say remotes.update setting.onServer event, connect, and then we'll connect this to a function, but let's go ahead and create that function first. And this function is going to be called update setting, which is going to accept a player as well as the setting, which is of course of the setting type. And now we have that function. Let's go ahead and hook that up to the networking. So update setting. Perfect. Now, whenever a player tries to toggle one of the settings, what we first want to do is confirm that that setting actually exists. The reason for this is because if somebody's hacking or exploiting, they could send us a fake setting, and that can cause an error when this function is ran. So what we're going to do is create a variable called doesSettingExist, and what we're going to do is look inside of the settings table for this specific setting. So we're going to use the table.find method. We're going to look through the settingsconfig.settings table for the specific setting that the client passed to us. Now, if the setting does not exist, then what we're going to do is stop the function right there. Now that we know that the setting does exist, what we'll then do is get the player's profile and then go ahead and toggle the setting. So to get the player's profile, we'll of course use the player data manager module. Then inside of the profiles table, we of course need to index that with the player. Now, if we're not able to find the profile, then we want to stop the function right there. Now that we have the player's profile, we need to get the current value of the setting. So we'll create a variable called current value, which is going to be equal to profile.data. We'll go inside of the settings table, and then we're going to index that with the specific setting. And now that we have that value, we now want to update the player's data by setting this value to the opposite of what it currently is. So what we can do is pretty much just copy the end of this line right here and paste it directly down here. So to actually update the player's data, we're going to set this equal to not current value. So if it's currently on, then it'll be toggled off, and if it's off, it'll be toggled to on. And now that we've updated the player's setting, what we're then going to do is replicate that back to the client. So we'll say remotes.update setting, fire client. We'll pass through the player, we'll pass through the setting, and we'll also pass through the new value as well, and the new value would be not current value. And now that we've done all of that, we're actually done with scripting this on the server side. So we can go ahead and close out of that script, and we can also close the server script service as well. Next, what we're going to do is update the player state manager. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside the client folder, and open up the state module script. Now, inside of here, we're going to go all the way down towards the bottom. And of course, we'll go ahead and copy and paste the last remote event. We'll then hook this up to the update setting remote event. For the parameters, we'll of course accept the setting, which we're just going to say is a string. And then we'll also get the new value as well, which is going to be a Boolean. Now, to go ahead and update this, we're going to go inside of the player data table. We'll then go inside of the settings table. We'll then index that with the specific setting. And then we'll update that value with the brand new value. And now, with that being said, that's all we have to do for the state manager. We can go ahead, close out of that, and close up the replicated storage. Now let's begin scripting the GUI on the client side. So we're going to go inside of the start player, inside of the start player scripts, inside of the GUI folder, and let's go ahead and duplicate the code's local script. We'll rename this to be called settings. And then let's go ahead and open it. Inside of here, we want to update the config. Instead of using the codes config, we of course want to use the settings config. We'll then go down to the GUI, and the GUI that we actually want to look for is called settings, not codes. And then we'll create a variable for the container as well, which is inside of the frame. We then have the exit button, which is perfect, but then the rest of these variables we can sort of just delete. Well, we can also delete like most of these functions as well. We'll only leave the exit button. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and create two constant variables. The first one is going to be called onColor, which is going to be equal to color3.fromRGB. And for the onColor, I'm going to use a nice green. So I'm going to go with 66, 255, and 60. Then we'll go ahead and create another variable. This is going to be called offColor. And this is, of course, going to be a red. So we'll go with 255, 60, 63. Cool. So now that we've created all those variables, let's go ahead and start creating the function for generating all the settings inside of the container frame. We'll go ahead and create a function called generate settings. Inside of this function, we want to loop through all the settings inside of our table inside of the settings config. So we'll say for_setting in settings config dot settings do. What we now want to do is clone that template inside of the container. So we'll say local clone equals container .template, and then we're going to go ahead and clone that. Now that we've cloned that, we're going to go ahead and update the name with the name of the setting. In addition to that, we also want to update the text of the setting text label inside of the clone as well. So we'll say clone.setting.text, and we'll set that equal to the setting as well. And now that we've updated all those properties, we also need to make sure that we parent this to the container as well. So we'll say clone.parent equals container. And one of the last properties that we have to update is the visibility property. So we're going to say clone.visible equals true. Now that we've done that, there's also one more thing that we have to do, and that's actually listen for whenever the toggle button has been clicked. So we're going to say clone.toggle.mousebutton1click, connect, and then we'll create an anonymous function. And inside of this anonymous function, we're going to use that update setting remote event that we created earlier. So we'll say remotes.update setting fire server and we'll pass through the specific setting. So now whenever this toggle button is clicked, the client will communicate with the server and say, hey, I want to toggle the setting from on to off or off to on. And with that being said, we're almost done with creating this function, but in order to completely finish this, we also need to create another function. So let's go above this function, and we're going to go ahead and create another one, which is actually going to be called update settings. And again, that's not going to have any parameters. What we want to do inside of this function is we actually want to go through all the settings inside of our container, and we want to update the background color of the button based on the state of the setting, so if it's toggled on or off. So in order to do this, we're going to say for_setting in settings_config.settings. Now we're going to go ahead and find that setting inside of the container. So we're going to say container, find first child, and we're going to look for that specific setting. Now, if we're not able to find that clone, then we want to continue iterating through the loop. Now that we found that clone, we then want to check if the setting is active. So we're going to create a variable called isSettingActive. And how we're going to set this is by using that function that we created earlier inside of the settings config called isSettingActive. So we'll say settingsconfig .isSettingActive. We'll pass through the setting, and then we'll also pass through the state manager .getData as well. And now that we've done that, like I said, the only thing that we're doing here is updating the background color of the button. So we're going to say clone.toggle.backgroundcolor3 equals, if the setting is active, then we of course want to use the on color. Otherwise, we want to use the off color. And now that we've created this function, whenever it's called, it's going to update the only dynamic thing inside of this GUI, which is the button of the setting, whether it's toggled on or off. Now, like I said, the reason that we created this function is because we need to use that along with generate settings. Now, when are we going to call the update settings function? Well, we're going to call it after we finish this for loop. So we'll say update settings, and now we've completely finished our generate settings function as well. When are we going to call the generate settings function? Well, it's really simple. We're just going to call it right after we create it. So let's go ahead and call it just like that. Now, one more thing that we need to implement here, and that is the networking. So whenever the server communicates back to us on the client and says this setting has been updated, we want to go ahead and use our update settings function to update the color of all the buttons if any of them have changed. So we can go inside the remotes folder. We'll then use the update setting remote event .onClientEvent :connect. We'll create an anonymous function. And inside of here, because of how long we've been working with the state manager, we're going to use task.delay. We'll wait 0 seconds, and then we'll actually call the update settings function. The reason that we're doing this is because we need to make sure that we wait for the state manager to get updated before we call the update settings function, because this function relies on the state manager's data. And now that we've done all that, we're actually completely finished with scripting this on the client side, so we can go ahead and close out of that. We can also close up the starter player scripts as well as the starter player. Now, let's go ahead and actually test this out. In order to test this out, let's go ahead and make our initial template not visible. So we're going to go inside of the settings GUI, inside of the frame, inside of the container, and for the template, we want to set the visibility to false, and then we can close all of that back up and start up our game to test this out. You know, this random gift is really annoying and so bothersome. Let's go ahead and fix this, which I realize now is a simple fix I could have fixed like 50 episodes ago. So a quick way to fix this is simply by selecting the GUI, and then we're actually going to update the display order property, and we'll set this to something like -1 because the default is 0. So as long as this is less than all of the other GUIs, this will appear below all of them, so it won't bother us when we're doing these quick tests or anything like that. Anyways, with that being said, let's go back and test this out. And now that we've loaded into our game, we can actually see all of the settings appear perfectly for us. We can also see that if we click on any of these buttons, they will turn red, and if they're red, they will turn green. So that means that toggling the setting on and off is actually working perfect. We can also test the exit button as well, so let's click that, and we can see the GUI disappeared. Perfect. Now what we can begin doing is actually implementing each of the individual settings. Now the first setting that we're going to implement is toggling on or off skipping the hatch animation. So in order to do this, we actually need to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and open up the eggs module script. Inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and get the settings config. And now that we've gotten that, we want to scroll down to the get hash cooldown function. Inside of here, we check if the player has the specific game pass, but instead of just checking that, we also want to check if the player has the setting toggled on as well. So what we're going to do is create a variable called should skip animation, and this is going to be true if the player has the game pass and the player has the setting enabled as well. So we'll use the isSettingActive, and the setting that we want to check is skip hatch animation, and we'll pass through the player's data. And now the last thing that we want to do in this function is return something, but instead of checking if the player has the game pass, we want to check if the should skip animation variable is true. And now that we've implemented it here, we also need to implement this when we script the GUI on the client side. So we can close out of this module script, and we can also close out of this settings module script as well. Then what we're going to do is go inside of the start player, inside of the start player GUI, open up the GUI folder, and then we'll open up the eggs local script. Inside of here, we're going to create a variable for the settings config. And now that we've done that, we need to go to the hatch animation function. Now, right here where we create the owns game pass function, below this, we actually want to create another function similar to how we just did in the other egg script. This variable is going to be called should skip animation. And the value of this is going to be owns game pass, and the setting is enabled. And the setting, of course, that we're going to use is skip hatch animation, and we'll pass through the player's data. Then, of course, to set the tween duration, instead of checking if the player owns the game pass, we're going to check if the should skip animation variable is set to true. Now, luckily, while we're in the script, we actually have one more setting that we can implement directly inside of here. And we're going to implement this all the way towards the bottom of our script. This is actually the global messages setting, so we can toggle on or off if we want to see when a player hatches a really rare pet. In order to do this, we're going to create a variable called has setting enabled. And of course, that's going to be set to what we usually set it to, settings config.is setting active. This time, the setting name is called global messages. And of course, we'll pass through the state manager.get data. Now, if the player does not have that setting enabled, then we should stop the function right there because the player does not want to see these messages appear in chat. Now that we've implemented that setting as well, we can go ahead and exit out of the script. The next setting that we'll actually implement is the random GIF setting. And in order to do this, we actually need to go into another GUI script as well. And the GUI script that we need to go inside of is the random GIF script. Inside of here, we'll of course create a variable for the settings config. And we also want to get the player's state manager as well. Now that we've gotten both of those, what we then want to do is go inside of the update GUI function. And inside of here, we're going to create a variable called should display. And how we're going to determine if it should be displayed or not is based on if the setting is active. The setting that we're going to check is called random GIFs, and of course we'll pass through the player's data. Now, if the message should not be displayed, then we're going to stop the function right there. And we're done implementing that, so we can go ahead and close out of that script. And now we're done with the GUI folder, so we can close that as well. But we're now going to implement two more settings, which is going to be display my pets and display others' pets. And now in order to implement this, we actually have to go inside of the pet follow script. Inside of here, let's go ahead and create a variable for the settings config. Now that we have that, we're going to want to go inside of the pet follow function. Inside of here, after we add the brand new pet to the player's pets table, what we're then going to do is check if the pet should be displayed. So we'll create a variable called should display pet. And what we're going to do is first, we're going to check if the player passed to this function is the local player. And if it is, then what we're going to do is we're going to use settings config.is setting active. We're going to check the show my pet setting. And of course, we'll pass through the state manager.get data. Now this is going to stretch out really long. So let me just go ahead and kind of format this a little bit. Now, if the player is not the local player, so if this function is called to display another player's pets, we're again going to use this function. So let's just go ahead and copy and paste this. Instead of checking show my pets though, we're going to check show other pets. And now once we've determined if we should display the pet or not, if we should not display the pet, then we're going to go ahead and stop the function right there. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is go all the way towards the bottom of the script. What we now want to do is listen for the update setting remote event to be fired, because if we toggle either the show other pets or show my pet setting, we then want to respawn or hide all of the player's pets that are currently in the game. Now, in order to access this remote event, we're actually just going to go directly through the replicated storage variable because our remotes variable is set to the pets folder inside of the remotes folder. So we're going to say replicate storage.remotes.update setting.onClient event :connect, and then we'll create an anonymous function. The first parameter is setting, which is of course of the settings config.setting type. We then have the value, which is a boolean. Now, first we want to check if the setting is either of the settings that we're actually looking for. So if the setting that we've just toggled does not equal show other pets, and it also does not equal show my pets, then we don't want to do anything else, so we're going to stop the function right there. After that, we're going to use task.wait0. And of course, the reason that we're doing that is because some of the things that we're going to be doing from now on relies on the state manager being updated, so that's why we have to use task.wait to guarantee that the state manager has enough time to update before we call functions which rely on that updated data. Now, first, we're going to check if the setting equals show my pets. And if it is this setting, we then want to do something based on the new value. Now, if the value is true, then we actually want to call the initialize player function. And of course, we'll pass through the player. But otherwise, if the value is false, then we actually want to hide all of the pets. And we'll just leave a comment here for right now that says hide pets. Now, then what we're going to do is we're going to say else. So if the setting is not show my pets, then we know it's show other pets. And this time what we want to do is we actually want to loop through all the players that are currently in our game and then either show or hide their pets based on the new value. So let's go ahead and loop through all the players. We'll say in players, get players do. Now, if the player equals the local player, so this client, then we just want to go ahead and skip over them. Now that we're guaranteeing we only have players that we actually want to work with, so all the players except for our client, we then need to either hide or show their pets based on what the new value is. So we'll say if value, then, And just like how we show our own pets, we're going to do the same thing for each of these individual players. So we'll say initialize player, pass through the player, and then if the value is false, we also want to hide the pets as well. Now, in order to hide the pets, we're just going to go ahead and create a function for handling this. It's going to be called delete pet folder, and it's going to accept a player, which is of course of the player type. What we want to do with this function is we actually want to delete the folder called pets inside of the player's character, as that will effectively hide all of the player's pets that are currently following them. So let's go ahead and try to get the player's character by saying player.character. If we're unable to find the character, then we want to stop the function right there. But if we are able to find the character, then we want to see if we can go ahead and find the folder called pets. Now, if we're not able to find that pet folder, then we again want to stop the function right there. And finally, if we do find the pet folder, we then want to destroy it to hide all of the player's pets. Now that we've created this function, let's go ahead and replace our past comments by calling this function. So we'll say delete pet folder, and we'll pass through the local player. And down here, we'll call this function again, this time passing through the other player. And with that being said, we've now fully implemented this, and we're completely done with implementing all the settings that we can currently implement. So let's go into our game and test this out. Now, the simplest setting that I think that we could really test out is the pet setting. So we're going to go inside of our pets inventory, equip all of our best pets. We'll then click on show my pets. When we toggle that off, we can see all of the pets have been deleted. But if we click, we can see that we're still getting a huge click booster from all of those pets. And if we check the pet inventory, we can still see that they're equipped as well. If we toggle this setting back on, we can see all the pets respawn and follow behind us once again. And we can easily keep toggling on and off this setting, and it seems like we're having no issues with that, so that's working perfectly. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with that all being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you guys did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button, and go check out my Patreon if you want to support me over there. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.